All right, so we're again in the three missionary journeys. We're looking at the time he spent in the region of Asia Minor, which is where Galatia is. And when you look at the map, I found this one this morning that I added to this. This is all three missionary journeys together. So you can see the first one here in the blue. Again, from Antioch to Cyprus, Pamphylia is labeled here. Comes on to Antioch of Pisidia, Iconium. In reading that text again, I really hadn't read it that closely, but when we think of the second missionary journey, he spent most of his time in Corinth, the third in Ephesus. Never really looked at it real close in the first missionary journey, but says he was a long time in Iconium. So Iconium seems to have been kind of the center of operations for him in this first missionary journey. But you can see he goes from Antioch of Pisidia to Iconium, where he spent most of his time, to Lystra, where he's actually stoned there at that location, to Derbe, and then comes back again. The second missionary journey is in the red to Corinth. So he and Barnabas have a falling out. Barnabas and Mark go here, and again, most people draw it, going through Derbe and Lystra and those same places, and then on to Mysia and on to Corinth, where he wound up going. The text, as we looked at the other day, said he went into Phrygia and Galatia, and then he went this way. Now, looking at that again, I was reading that again this morning. It says Phrygia and Galatia. Was it talking about a new place in Galatia, or is it talking about, like, as we would say it, as well as where he'd already been in Galatia? Again, I don't know. The third missionary journey, he spends most of his time in Ephesus. Again, most people have it drawn that he goes here. This is where he spends most of that time, and then he goes to some of the other locations. My point is, none of these have him going up in other parts of Galatia. And there's, I had always, as I had looked at this, never had really thought about it until I was studying it for this lesson, I'd always thought of the church of Galatia being Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia. A lot of the commentators don't think that's the case. Whether it is or isn't, I guess it doesn't matter. I think he did go to all of these in his missionary journeys. The question is, did he go into some of these other regions? Maybe he did. And maybe he is writing the letter to other churches we don't have recorded. But the things that are written in the book of Galatians certainly fit with the things we've read here. That Jews and Gentiles believed. You had unbelieving Jews that came in and tried to stir the people up. And it kind of fits with what we're looking here. So, like I say, that it's neither here nor there. It's, again, an interesting point to me. And I said, I've always taken it for granted, and like in this map you see, that it draws Galatia here. You'll see some maps where it doesn't. And it refers to the city of Lystra and Derbe as being cities of Lycaonia. So the question is, was that a different province or just an area of Galatia? And as I say, it's really neither here nor there. It's just, as Brother Israel would say, it's an academic point. It's an interesting point to me related to that. I mentioned to you, I think we close with this idea. In the third missionary journey, as we talked about in a lot of detail in the books of Corinthians, Paul has taken up a collection for the poor saints at Jerusalem. And one of the directions he had given to the church of Corinth is that they send somebody with their contribution to accompany him to Jerusalem. And he says they'd given the same directions to the church of Galatia. And we'll talk about that in more detail. Was that written directions, or was that something by word of mouth? Again, we don't know. But I assume he had told them the same thing. When you look at the people that are journeying with him, the only ones that are mentioned are Gaius of Derbe and Timothy, who we think was from Lystra. And so it doesn't mention anybody else in that connection. Could there have been somebody else that met him later on? Could have been, but again, that still seems to fit to me with those Derbe and Lystra being part of the church of Galatia. Again, I don't know if it is or not, but yes, both.
It looks like when you're looking at the map, it looks like he kind of scaled his journeys up as he progressed.
Yeah.
The spots that he hit on the first journey went significantly further on the second,
yes,
and third, and then he did a lot more water travel on the last one, the voyage to Rome. What was his ages during these times?
Paul's ages. That's a great question, Brother Bo. We don't know. We're not told in the scriptures anything regarding his ages. It's kind of little bit of speculation. When he was watching Stephen being stoned in Acts chapter 7, it says a young man named Saul is all that it says there. So it pictures him at the stoning of Stephen being a young man. In the book of Philemon, I think it is, in that book, he says Paul the aged. So as far as any real numbers, he doesn't really give us that. I wish we had that. That'd be interesting to know. But he goes from young, and I've heard speculation on that. A lot of people think that maybe he was in his 30s, when he's converted. I don't know, but that's a great point. Great point.
So after he was converted, roughly how long before he started to go on these journeys?
And that's a great question too. We think he was converted around AD 36 or 37. And I mentioned y'all, most of the people in the first missionary journey think it was AD 48 and 49, but it's really hard even from my standpoint to really lock that down. There's a couple of the things in between where it says, well, he was a long time here, or he was a long time here. How long was a long time? So I think particularly the first missionary journey, I think there's more speculation. I said AD 48 and 49 is what I normally have seen, but it could have been a couple of years. I don't think it's much later than that. It could have been as early as AD 43 or 44. So you're looking at anywhere from, depending, 8 to 12 years after his conversion, when he's probably going through the first missionary journey. Roughly 10, we could say, there. The second missionary journey, we're pretty sure, was around AD 51 or 52. The third one, from about AD 54 to about AD 57 or 58 would be the time frames in there. So you're looking at, by the end of his third missionary journey, it's probably about 20 years since his conversion, roughly. Again, his exact age, again, it's kind of speculation how old he actually was at that point. Good point. Any other questions or comments on any of that? Brother Scott.
We know, did Paul ever return to any of the cities where he had been stoned?
Well, we know in Acts 16 that he went to Lystra and Derbe again, and we think that's where he picked up Timothy, and Timothy accompanied him the rest of the time on his other journeys. So, to your point, that's a great point. Took a lot of guts to go back to where somebody just stoned you. But yes, it appears that he did go back to Lystra, and I think in the third journey it says he went through strengthening some of his churches, and you see that, and it doesn't give us a lot of detail. So again, the question is, Brother Bo mentioned, looks like he's going a little bit further north, and he may have gone. These are people guesses. He may have gone further up into the northern parts. He may have, which means that the church of Galatia might have been, again, may not have been Lystra and Derbe. It may have been some that we don't have recorded.
Well, I would think that would be a very strong way of. I would think that he could win over many people, knowing that he had returned back to see them and to try to spread the gospel in and around those
Right.
areas. That maybe that might have helped tremendously with his intention and a profitable visit.
We look at some of the places that he, we focus on places like Corinth that he visited in his second missionary journey, and his third, and Ephesus. You think about how blessed these people were. More than likely, he visited those all three times. So again, whether they're exactly Galatia or whatever, but it's definitely the people in that region got to hear a lot of the preaching of Paul. And as we said before, probably Peter too. So you think about Peter and Paul, these great preachers being in that area, how blessed the people were to hear those great men preach on those occasions.
Absolutely.
One thing I'm convinced of when we read the book of Galatians, I think y'all will get this feeling too. All the commentators say this. Whoever he's writing to in Galatians, he had visited them in person. He's not writing to people that he had never met or whatever. It's pretty obvious from things that he says that I was among you. So whoever it is, whether it be these cities here or whether he did journey here to unrecorded cities, it's people that he did come in contact with during at least his second and third missionary journeys. Are the people that are the recipients of this letter that he's writing. All right, great points, great questions. All right, again, the bell called us as we were looking at some of this the other day, and some of these maps, and part of the problem with these maps appears to be that the boundaries, the Roman boundaries of Galatia, seem to have fluctuated a lot. Apparently, they didn't have any natural boundaries. So that's part of the problem of pinpointing exactly what cities is he writing to. Because the boundaries sometimes would grow, provinces become bigger, sometimes smaller, and it would depend. Like on this map right here, to this point, you see that Lycaonia is listed, and Pisidia and Phrygia are kind of listed as regions or parts of Galatia. But you see other maps where it's got them drawn as being separate regions. So it's a lot of speculation on exactly who the people are that we are looking at and talking about here. Now, here's another map. It's got it drawn differently. Here you got, again, Galatia. Ankara today, I mentioned this last Sunday, this is still the capital of modern-day Turkey today. So again, it was a very prominent city then and still is today. So that's the capital of Turkey. Byzantium, where Istanbul is today, Constantinople, is the largest city of Turkey, but it's not the capital. The capital is actually right here where Galatia was in Ankara. So again, you see here in this map that Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe are listed as a separate province. But again, was this a region, a part of Galatia? Well, again, we're not sure. This is another map I found. This is showing the earliest churches recorded congregations of the first century. So ones the scripture specifically mentioned at some point in the writings. Obviously, we would think there was a lot more congregations that are unrecorded. So it certainly is possible there are churches in Galatia that are unrecorded on this trip that he did establish as he was journeying to some of these places. Here's another one showing local church of the Bible around AD 70. So ones that are mentioned specifically in various passages. And so again, you see some ones that we talked about. A number in the land of Israel, Damascus, Antioch, where Paul was much of his time. Tarsus, his hometown. Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and so forth. The 7 churches of Asia that I mentioned in the book of Revelation. And I'm confident, that there were other churches established in some of these areas too. But that's the ones that we have listed in the scriptures. This is another showing some of the Christian communities of modern-day Turkey, of this area of Asia Minor. Okay, so we first of all start with something let's start with something we are pretty sure about, confident of, the writer of the book of Galatians. So we're confident that Paul is the writer. You and I, we're confident anytime we read the scriptures and somebody claims to be the writer. But Brother Joel talks about higher critics. Sometimes there are people that are dissected and say, well, could be somebody that was posing as an apostle that wrote this or whatever. But nobody doubts this, that Paul was a writer. Yes, sir.
When did he write this, and when did this occur in relationship to the other epistles that he wrote?
The dates are all over the place on that too, Brother Bill. That's a great point. My belief, we'll get to this more later on, I think it was sometime during the third missionary journey, is my view. I think it was after he had gone through on his third missionary journey. I think probably at Ephesus, he was writing back to them. So around the 50s, so probably AD 55, 56, 57, in that time frame, I think.
And Romans would have been earlier or later?
Romans, great point, great question. When I read the books of Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians sounds very similar to those books. So I'm confident it was written somewhere within a year or two, I believe, because he's hitting the same subjects, talking about the same things he is in other books. So that's my belief. But
Philippians would come later?
So Philippians would be later. That would be when he was actually in prison in Rome. That'd be probably 2 or 3 years later after these books. Yes, sir. Good point. Any other questions, comments on that? I'm probably making it muddy in the water more than I'm helping going through some of this. All right, B.W. Johnson wrote this. He said, it only remains to say concerning its genuineness, the genuineness of this book. How we doing, Brother Dallas? That the internal evidences of the authorship of Paul is so strong that no sane divine has ever denied or even doubted it. He's quoting a guy named Schaff. There is no other writer of the early church who could have written it. It bears the Pauline stamp in every line. So pretty strong statement, endorsement there. Here's one by commentators Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. They say The internal and external evidence for Paul's authorship is conclusive. The style is characteristically Pauline. The superscription at the end, let me see if my Bible has it. Some copies don't. Let's see. Mine does not. Some copies say written from Rome. There's a lot of debate about that. Was that accurate that he really was writing for Rome? I tend to think he wrote from Ephesus during that third missionary journey, but again, that's really neither here nor there. It says the style is characteristically Pauline. The superscription and allusions to the apostle of the Gentiles in the first person throughout the epistle establishes the same truth. His authorship is also upheld by the unanimous testimony of the ancient church, including Irenaeus, Polycarp, and Justin Martyr. Here's Brother Johnson's introduction to the book. In his introduction, he mentions these things. It says, this epistle differs from most of those written by Paul in that it is not addressed specially to the church in some great city, but to the churches throughout a district of the Roman Empire. Galatia will be seen on any map of the empire in the apostolic period in the interior of the great peninsula called Asia Minor. It's also called Anatolia. It's the same thing, which was a theater of so large a part of the labors of Paul. The people of the Gallic stock had marched from the Rhine River to Greece and thence into Asia about 280 BC, and had conquered a home in the interior of Asia Minor, which henceforth took a new name from the people, Galli or Gauls, who made it their seat. Now, I'm sure y'all know this, so let me just ask this real quick. When historians talk about the area of Gaul, what area of the modern world is that located? The area of Gaul. Not in Turkey. Actually, France.
France.
So that's a long distance away. Yes, it is. So, and some of the commentators will talk about some of the those that wind up settling in this area and conquering out an area said were Gauls and Celtics. And I'm sure, where are the Celtics? Where were they located?
Celtics?
The Celtics. Not in Boston, not the Boston Celtics.
Israel. Ireland.
Ireland, England, yes.
Wales.
So Great Britain. So it's interesting that they feel like some of the people that settled this area were actually from modern-day France and England that came in during those years, which is...
The Celtic would have been the people from Wales, that area, principally.
Yes, sir. Before the Angles and the Saxons came in and conquered them later on. Yes. All right, so again, these people came in and settled it. They learned the Greek language, but retained in part their old tongue and the traits of their race. Caesar described the Gauls as restless and changeable, characteristics still of the French, and this epistle shows that the Galatians were not unlike their European kinsmen. What it's saying is the people of that area apparently are related by blood to people in France and England and some of those areas. Rule of Anatolia. This was interesting to me, and again, this may not interest y'all, and again, I'm probably getting bogged down too much on this. But one thing that strikes me, this part of the area of the world, there's a lot of fighting that has gone on back and forth over the years, and it's been under various people controlling them over time. And so I've got a list of this. I'm going to show you some maps here just to kind of illustrate this. The Trojan War took place on this peninsula. You've heard of Helen of Troy and the Trojan horse and all the events with the fall of Troy, Odysseus or Ulysses. His wars are recorded in his journey home, and all that is interesting to me. The Iliad and the Odyssey are written here. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Gauls that we just mentioned, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Mongols, and the Turks. And again, share with you a couple of maps, and y'all can pipe up and add anything you want to this, but just real quick, try to do this real quick. So here's not a great map, but again, Asia Minor, that we're talking about where Turkey is today. So there's the city, the legendary city of Troy, and that site has been found. For years, historians thought, well, maybe this was just a completely made-up location. But the city of Troy, they did find, archaeologists did. You may also find in a couple things that the commentators write, they'll talk about the Hellespont. The Hellespont is just the strait here that separates Asia from Europe. So here you're considered to be in Asia, here you're considered to be in Europe, but the Hellespont is this area, that waterway in between those. The Hittite Empire. This is interesting to me for a couple of things. You'll notice that the Hittites basically controlled at one time all of Turkey was under Hittite rule. A famous Bible critic named Voltaire, you've heard Brother Joel mention Voltaire. And Brother Joel said that when Voltaire died, they were printing, he said he vowed he was going to destroy Christianity and destroy the Bible. And within 2 weeks of his death, they were printing the Bible on his old printing press, which is ironic. But Voltaire, and I've tried to find some of the quotes from Voltaire, and I can't find it. People try to cover up some things that he said because some of the things that he said would make him look pretty ignorant. And so a lot of times on the left, you have an active cover-up going on. They don't want you to find out stuff like this. At some point, I'm going to find a book or something on things that Voltaire said. Even one time on the internet, to show you how biased the internet is sometimes, I typed in stupid quotes that Voltaire made about the Bible. And the first thing that popped up was an article praising Voltaire and nothing about what he said about the Bible. But he was a critic of the Bible, and a lot of things that he said in attacking the Bible to show that it was false would be things like the Hittites. He would point out things like he would say Nineveh was not really a city. Nineveh was a fairy tale, a made-up city. There was no Nineveh. We know from archaeology it was a great city, just like the Bible described it. But that was one of his points. Voltaire would also talk about the Hittites. So the Bible talks about Hittites. There is no evidence there ever were Hittites. They didn't even live. Yes, there have been a ton of evidence now uncovered that the Hittites were indeed a great people, just the Bible describes them. You remember probably one of the most well-known Hittites in the Bible. What Brother Bill talked about this in his lessons on the Kings. When you think of a loyal, let me give you a hint, a loyal soldier of David that is called somebody the Hittite. Uriah, who David treated very badly, as we know, and had him killed, committed adultery with his wife. So Uriah is called a Hittite, and you can find Abraham bought property from the Hittites on one occasion, I believe in Genesis 25. But anyway, my point is they were a great people. Matter of fact, history shows, we know a lot of the Egyptian empire, but they were rivals of Egypt. And they were pretty much militarily, they're pretty much as strong as Egypt. And in archaeology, they say the Hittites were some of the first people to use iron, which is one thing that made them such a great people and strong people. But I digress. But anyway, the Hittites, you can see much of modern-day Turkey was under Hittite rule. And this is kind of considered their heyday here. For about 500 years, they were really, really a strong, powerful people. The Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire fluctuated over time, and it kind of reached its apex, you might say, just before it fell, in the same century that it fell. But you see, they don't control all of Turkey, but parts of Turkey was under Assyrian control. I didn't put Babylonia there. Babylon didn't get into Turkey, but had a little bit on the fringes under Babylonian control. I should have had that. The Persians is interesting. The Persians controlled at some point in time, they controlled all of modern-day Turkey. We're familiar with the Persians in reading the book of Daniel. You're familiar with Darius or Darius, however you say his name, Cyrus the Great, some of those that are mentioned. The book of Esther, the Persian kings that are mentioned there, and Ezra and Nehemiah. But Persia controlled, again, all this in this area, but all the way here, and even parts of the Balkan Peninsula. One of the goals of King Darius, Darius the First, I think it was, actually invaded Greece, and was defeated at the Battle of Marathon, a very famous battle in history in 490 BC. He goes home whipped, and his son Ahasuerus, who is mentioned in the book of Esther, comes back 10 years later and actually gets to Athens and burns the city of Athens in that particular trip. Eventually is defeated and driven out of that area. But you see right on the doorstep of Greece, we mentioned, Brother Bill, I think, mentioned the roads, some of the roads the other day. I thought this was interesting on the map. So this is called the Royal Road that goes from Susa along the Tigris and all the way through Turkey to the city of Sardis, which is one of the churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, which is interesting to me. So again, all of this area at one time was under Persian control. The Greek Empire. Now again, you had the Persians, and then you have a little overlap with Alexander the Great. You're familiar with Alexander the Great and his father Philip II, who is the king of Macedon. He went through and conquered all of Greece. He was assassinated in the year 336 BC. His son Alexander becomes the king of Greece and begins going to conquer the world in 336 BC. And it's not long before he brings the Turkish people under his dominion. And then he fights two epic battles with Darius III. One is at the Battle of Issus, which was fought, I believe, November the 5th, 333 BC. And then the Battle of Gaugamela, which was fought October the 1st, I think, 331 BC. And so with that, the defeat of Darius III, and he goes on into parts of India and conquers all that area. So the Persian Empire falls under his control. But again, Turkey becomes Greek at this point and begins speaking Greek. And Brother Scott was talking before class, Galatians 4, verses 4 and 5, talk about in the fullness of time, Christ came into the world. And this is one of those events. The Greek language became the language of the people, the language of the New Testament. And I've heard Brother Joel and others talk about one of the most precise languages, one of the most beautiful languages, one of the most exact languages there's ever been. And so it's interesting that God picked that language to reveal the will of his new covenant. But Alexander coming through helped accomplish that. Alexander's empire, as y'all know, later was divided into 4 parts. Daniel prophesied that. This area of modern-day Turkey was, I never know how to pronounce this, but Antigonus, I think the Antagonids, I think is what they were, and they fought back and forth with the Ptolemies in Egypt. But again, they remained Greek as a people for a couple of centuries. We mentioned the Gauls and the Celtics a minute ago. B.W. Johnson mentioned this, and a couple other commentators mentioned this as well. Again, Gaul is, when you hear Gaul, and you hear people writing about that, it's pretty much modern-day France. But you'll see the Gauls and the Celtics come in. Here's Turkey right here, and you see right in the middle. You see it highlighted with Gauls and Celtics in that region. So you had kind of those individuals being related to the later French and the English people, the British people, which is interesting. Of course, the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire did not extend as far into the east as the Persian and the Greeks did, but it extended further this way. And so the entire Mediterranean area was under Roman rule. By the year 133 BC, Rome pretty much had control of the Mediterranean. The city of Rome itself fell in AD 476. And before that, it had shrunk in power in the years leading up to this. But you can see at its strongest point, I mean, much of Great Britain, I think there's a wall here, I want to say called Hadrian's Wall, one of the Roman emperors built. I guess they couldn't defeat the Scottish people or decided not to. But much of Great Britain they conquered. And of course, a lot of our ideas of government and liberty and freedom come from the Romans and that Roman influence on the English people.
But in the United States, it came from Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and all the rest of them.
Good point. Good point, Charlie. The Byzantine Empire, to be very honest with you, I didn't know as much about this until I was teaching this just a few years ago. I would hear in school the Byzantine empires, and there was kind of a disconnect in my mind of what they were. But all the Byzantine Empire was, it was the Eastern Roman Empire. So while Rome fell in the year 476, parts of this empire, the city of Constantinople, did not fall until the year 1453. This is 39 years before Christopher Columbus. So you had vestiges of the Roman Empire that lasted throughout the Middle Ages. And that's what the Byzantine Empire was. It was the Roman Empire. My point to all that is, again, you see Turkey, which was under Byzantine rule. So again, it remained under Roman influence for centuries, millennia, over a millennia of time. This was something I did not really know much about until recently either. China, I saw different maps, but some maps have some of this modern-day Turkey being under Chinese influence in the 1200s and 1400s. Matter of fact, the Chinese people, the Mongols, the empire of Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan, had actually conquered Moscow, was under their rule for a couple of hundred years before, I think it was Ivan the Great freed them from Mongol rule. The Ottoman Empire was prominent before the fall of Constantinople. Before this happened, they had conquered much of modern-day Turkey, but eventually they conquered Constantinople itself, renamed it Istanbul, and you see they had a vast empire as well. And here is modern-day Turkey today with its various provinces and this sort of thing. So, again, more information than what y'all needed or probably wanted to hear. But it's a very interesting part of the world to me. There's been a lot of people fighting over that part of the world, and it's had a big influence on the people of that vicinity in that region. Okay, any questions, comments on that before we leave any of that with you?
No.
All right. Okay, I'm going to try to go quickly. I may reduce some of this down before next time. I've got about 10 minutes left. Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown say the inhabitants, Gallo-Graecia, contracted into Galati, another form of the name Celts, were Gauls in origin, the latter having overrun Asia Minor after they had pillaged Delphi about 280 BC and at last permanently settled in the central parts. Their character of the people, as shown in this epistle, is an entire continence with that ascribed to the Gallic race by all writers. Julius Caesar wrote, "The infirmity of the Gauls is that they are fickle in their resolves and fond of change and not to be trusted." So Theory wrote, "Frank, impetuous, impressible, eminently intelligent, but at the same time extremely changeable, inconstant, fond of show, perpetually quarreling, the fruit of excessive vanity." So see, some of those aren't real complimentary of the people that we're going to be studying here. They received Paul at first with all joy and kindness, but soon wavered in their allegiance to the gospel and to him, and hearkened as eagerly now to Judaizing teachers as they had before to him. The apostle himself had been the first preacher among them, and again, that's pretty obvious from the book. Whatever cities he's talking about, it was places that Paul had visited, and had then probably founded churches, which at his subsequent visit he strengthened in the faith. His first visit was about AD 51 during his second missionary journey. So you can see that these writers do not include his first trip to Lystra, Iconium, Derbe as being a visit to the Galatians, and several of them felt that way. Adam Clark wrote this. It says, "Galatia was anciently a part of Phrygia and the neighboring countries. It had its name from the Gauls, who, having invaded Asia Minor, conquered this country and settled in it. As these were mixed with various Grecian families, the country was also called Gallo-Graecia. Under the reign of Augustus Caesar in 26 BC, it was reduced into the form of a Roman colony and was governed by a propraetor appointed by the emperor. This country is bounded on the east by Cappadocia, on the west by Bithynia, on the south by Pamphylia, and on the north by the Euxine Sea." This is an old name for the Black Sea, what we now call the Black Sea, where Ukraine is on the north part of the Black Sea today. "These are its limits according to Strabo, but the different provinces of Asia Minor, being the subjects of continual contentions, very frequently changed their boundaries as well as their masters and were seldom at one stay." And we mentioned that a moment ago. One reason it's hard to pinpoint this book is because the boundaries of Galatia could vary over various times. According to Pliny, their country was divided into 195 tetrarchies, and according to Strabo, each of the three main divisions was subdivided into 4 cantons, each of which had a tetrarch, and beside these 12 tetrarchs, there was a general council of the nation consisting of 300 senators. So at one time they had like 12 almost co-rulers of the region. Eventually that was reduced to 3 main rulers and 2, and then eventually one guy ruling over the entire territory. The last tetrarch and king of Galatia was Amytas, who from being secretary to Taurus, the first person that possessed the whole tetrarchy, was made king of Pisidia in 39 BC. And in 35 BC, Mark Antony made him tetrarch of Galatia. After the death of Amytas, Galatia was ranked by Augustus among the Roman provinces and governed as aforesaid. The administration of the propraetors continued till the reign of Theodosius the Great, or Valens, and under Christian emperors, it was divided into 2 provinces, Galatia Prima being subject to a consul, Galatia Secunda or Salutaris, governed by a president. Again, the point of all that is they were under Roman rule, as we're reading here. So they were subject to the Roman Empire during these times. Albert Barnes writes this: Galatia extends on the north to the Euxine or Black Sea. It was probably about 200 miles at its greatest extent from east to west and varied in width from anywhere from 12 to 150 miles. It was one of the largest provinces of Asia Minor. It had no natural boundary except on the north, the sea, of course. And of course, the limits may have been varied by conquest, as we mentioned earlier. The Gauls were mixed with the various Grecian families. They invaded Macedonia and Greece and subsequently invaded Asia Minor in 272 BC and became an object of terror to all that region. Some of the descriptions of them are pretty interesting to me. Such was their number that Justin says they filled all Asia like swarms of bees. They're being called in by the king of Bithynia for aid. When they had gained the victory, they divided the kingdom with him and called that region Gallo-Graecia. Under the reign of Augustus Caesar, about 26 BC, again, same thing we talked about, they made up Roman province and somebody was put as a ruler over them. They retained their original Gaulish language as late as the 5th century. At the same time, they also spoke the Greek language in common with all the inhabitants of Lesser Asia, and therefore the epistle to them was written in Greek and was intelligible to them as well as others. Of course, they could understand Greek and read Greek. But it's interesting, what they're saying is that they spoke a language similar to their French ancestors. So if you were traveling there, the languages in some cases would be similar to that at France at the time. The Galatians, like the inhabitants of the surrounding country, were pagans. And we'll see allusions to that in the book as well, idol worshippers and this sort of thing. They are said to have worshipped the mother of the gods under the name Agistus. Callimachus and his hymns calls them a foolish people, and Hilary himself, a Gaul, calls them Gallos indociles, expressions which may well excuse Paul's addressing them as foolish in Galatians 3 and verse 1. The possessors of Galatia were of 3 different tribes of Gauls. You can read that, these words. It is possible that while Peter was making converts in one part of Galatia, the Apostle Paul was in another, and that some claiming authority, as from Peter, propagated opinions not conformable to the views of Paul to correct and expose which was one design of this epistle. The Gauls are mentioned by ancient historians as a tall and valiant people. They went nearly naked, he says. Their arms are only a sword and buckler. Their impetuosity of their attack, it is said, was irresistible and was usually so victorious. So apparently very physical people and very skilled soldiers is what he's saying there. Barnes goes on to say, it is not possible to ascertain the number of the inhabitants of Galatia. In other words, how many people were in Galatia at this time? Nobody knows for sure. In 2 Maccabees, one of the apocryphal books, it said that Judas Maccabees told them of the battle which they had in Babylon with the Galatians, how they came but 8,000 in all to the business, but destroyed 120,000 because of the help which they had from heaven. So 120,000, they're not sure if that was referring to the people in Galatia or actually the people they were fighting. It is evident, however, that there was a large population that went under this general name, and it is probable that Galatia was thickly settled at the time when the gospel was preached there. It was in the central part of Asia Minor, then one of the most densely populated parts of the world, and was a region singularly fertile. Many persons also were attracted there for the sake of commerce. That there were many Jews also in all the provinces of Asia Minor is apparent not only from the Acts of the Apostles, but is expressly declared by Josephus. So Josephus says there was a lot of Jews living in that area, which certainly adds up with what we will be reading throughout this book. It is true that in the account of the mission of Paul and Barnabas in Acts 14, it is not expressly said that they went into Galatia, but it is said in Acts 14, 5 and 6 that they were in Iconium. An assault was made on them, or a purpose formed to stone them, and that they fled into Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and unto the region that lies round about. Pliny says that a part of Lycaonia bordered on Galatia and contained 14 cities, of which Iconium was the most celebrated. Phrygia also was contiguous to Galatia and to Lycaonia, and these circumstances render it probable that when Paul proposed to Barnabas to visit again the churches where they had preached, Galatia was included, and that they had been there before this visit referred to in Acts 16:6. It is quite evident, therefore, I think, that the gospel was preached among the Galatians first by Paul. And I think everybody would agree with that. So again, regardless of, was it the first missionary journey, second missionary journey, the first time he came to this region, Paul was the one that started the church in many of these places. It's possible, however, that Peter also may have preached in other parts of Galatia at the time that Paul was preaching in other parts, as we mentioned already. It is a circumstance also some importance on this point that Paul speaks in this epistle in a tone of authority and with the severity of reproof, which he would hardly have used unless he had at first preached there and had a right to be regarded as the founder of the church and to address it as its father. In this respect, to the tone here is quite different, as Mr. Locke has remarked, from what is observable in the epistle to the Romans. Paul had not been at Rome when he addressed the church there by letter, and his language differs materially from that which occurs in the epistle to the Corinthians and Galatians. It was to them very respectful and mild language of a stranger. It is respectful, but it is the authoritative language of a father having a right to reprove. What he's saying is that the tone is much different in the books of Corinthians and Galatians than in Romans. Again, he's talking to people he hasn't met there. In Corinthians and Galatians, he gets on to them pretty hard at times in this study. Okay, I appreciate your good attention. I'm going to try to cut some of this down. I've got a bunch of other stuff there.
What, I like the way Daniel talked about the saints. We're going to take over the kingdom.
All right, that's a good point, Charlie. The Christians are the saints, aren't we? We are the saints.
I mean, hey, he gave the saints authority to take it over.
All right, good point. Thank you for your good attention. Thank you for humoring me and listening to all of that material.